Truthspresso, episode 300.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truthspresso.
Truthspresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Well, hey there, all you friends, family members, foes, and, of course, not to leave out the lurkers alike, this is your host for Truthspresso, Daniel Minnick. And if you just noticed, that is, if you have been listener of Truthspresso for long enough to realize that what you just heard is not the usual introduction, perhaps you may have been thinking, or even a little bit worried, that you might have stumbled on to the wrong show. Well, not to fear, this is the same old great Truthspresso podcast that you have been listening to, but for episode 300 and moving forward, I have introduced a new introduction to the show. Now, why would I do that? Well, of course, episode 300 is quite a landmark, so I've got to do something special. But when I created the original introduction for Truthspresso, I had kind of a different idea in mind at the time, way back in the summer of 2019, what Truthspresso was going to be about. I was going to incorporate some Christian stuff, and I thought that I would be a little, cute about things, and I was also doing self-help episodes talking about college advice and personalities, introverts, extroverts, and stuff. So originally, Truthspresso had this kind of laid-back, warm and fuzzy self-help with some unique, unusual Christian topics thrown in, and then eventually I started to get into important topics in apologetics and politics, and the intro that I had created before, although it worked and it was fun, sometimes the subject matter would seem to be a little out of place with that introduction, and so I had been thinking for several months back that I really wanted a nice fresh update to the Truthspresso introduction and outro so that it would sound more like a talk show type of thing, and that the intro message and the music would be more apropos to cover a wide range of topics, and especially hard-hitting topics. And so I hope that if you really liked the old introduction, that you're not disappointed with the new one. I really hope that you enjoy the new intro and outro that sounds kind of like movie music. The intro sounds more like a movie trailer, an epic and exciting thriller movie trailer. And then you'll get to hear the new outro at the end of this episode, which sounds a little more like the end of a movie. So what special topic to cover do I have on this special 300th episode of Truthspresso? Well, I did mention in the previous episode that I would cover a few more exhibits that I visited and did some interviews while I was at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference that is hosted each year by the Christian Home Educators of Colorado, or affectionately known as CHEC, C-H-E-C. And so I have 3 interviews that I would like to play, and I'd like to just kind of introduce each one of these and the topic that we cover. Now, first, before I get into the interviews, I do want to talk a little bit about the conference itself. my wife and I, this is the second one of these conferences that we have had an exhibit at, and we did visit one 2 years ago for a little bit. We shopped around and stuff. But last year, and there is an episode of Truthspresso where we talked about last year's conference, and I played an interview reel that I did with some guest speakers and exhibits there. And so that's a new tradition that I want to start. And I haven't seen anyone else at the conference actually do what I'm doing. And so I'm the guy who goes around finding anyone who's willing to do recorded interviews. And I think it makes sense when you have an exhibit for people there. When people show up for your exhibit, you talk to them about it, you're advertising, you're pitching your products or services. Well, this is another avenue for people to do that. And the only difference is that I and my guest are holding a microphone. Otherwise, it's kind of the same thing. And instead of advertising to people who are in person there, they can advertise their products or services to listeners of Truthspresso. So I think it's a win-win. So Truthspresso gets an episode or two, and speakers or people selling products or services for homeschoolers at the conference kind of get to pitch them to a remote audience. Now, what's interesting about this year's Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference, it was originally going to be at the hotel that it was at last year, but we found out, I think maybe about at the most 4 months before this year's conference, that they had to change venues, and that was because the hotel, which was a pretty large hotel, it had a very large room to have, 100 exhibits or so, probably more than that, I haven't counted, but the conference is pretty large and they really all fit within this one very large room. But about 4 months before the scheduled event, we found out that we had to change venues to a different hotel because the long-standing hotel that was the place that this conference would always rent out got bought out and was turned into a homeless shelter, or a shelter likely for undocumented migrants. And so, that made things a little bit difficult for those who manage and host the conference, check. And so they had to quickly look for another venue. So they found another hotel, and it actually worked out nicely for my wife and me because it's about halfway closer to where we live. And so it's not as much of a drive. But they're having to work things out, and they promise to improve it next year because things were a little crazy in this conference and exhibits were kind of spread out across different rooms. And we found out when we were going to prepare for the exhibit for Castle Rock Women's Health that my wife runs, it was going to be in the pavilion, and the pavilion was a large tent outdoors. And so they pitched up this long white tent and they put like a carpeting inside. They had power cords for those whose exhibits needed power for things like monitors and laptops and anything that was on display that would be running. Like one exhibit was a 3D printing. Now, there was a larger 3D printer company that I actually did interview last year called IQless 3D Printing. They were indoors of the hotel, but there was one exhibit that was showing printing a chessboard, 3D printing, and so you need power for that. But all of this was out inside the pavilion in this large tent. And these days of the exhibit were going to be rather warm in Colorado. And so they had to apologize about what they knew the temperature was going to be. It kind of got stuffy, especially our exhibit was pretty much right in the middle of the tent. And so, they set up large fans, one on each side, and the exhibits on the just coming in would get a lot of this cool air, but right in the middle of the tent, it was like sweltering and stuffy. But hey, we're all Christians, and so, that's hardly persecution, if we have to endure 2.5 days of being hot to talk to women about services that they might need. We can't complain about that. But nevertheless, people coming in would be asking questions like, how long are you here? How do you put up with this for hours like this? And what else are we going to do? And do you need some women's health services? And then what's interesting on Friday, because the conference was basically Thursday evening, then all day Friday, and then most of the day Saturday, on Friday afternoon, we knew that there was going to be some inclement weather. It was going to rain, possibly hail, which it did somewhat. And there are even predictions of the possibility of tornadoes. And so we had to be prepared when the word came that the weather was coming. And then they gave us tablecloths to cover up our exhibits, gather what we couldn't risk outside in the pavilion, and bring it into the hotel. And so because of the weather, those of us who had exhibits in this tent had a little bit of a break while the weather was pouring down. And thankfully, the wind wasn't too bad and the hail wasn't too bad. We saw a few holes in the tent from hail, but, nothing we could see was harmed by any of the weather. But it was a pretty interesting conference there, being in the tent there, and we'll see what is in store for next year as we plan for doing this conference next year as well, where we will be, what they will do, if they have more time to plan for this and don't have to change venues. So at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference, there were some well-known speakers and influencers such as George Barna. You might have heard the name George Barna. He gave the opening keynote, and he's the one who's known for Barna polls. He will do lots of research and statistics and come out with different polls that show the state of Christianity in various aspects. And so, yes, you might have heard of George Barna. Of course, I always hope, since I'm the lone wolf wanting to try to do interviews for a podcast at this conference, I'm always hoping to find some of these well-known speakers to do an interview, like even if it's 3 minutes long or something, if I could just catch them on a break. But I found out that George Barna gave the opening keynote, and I think that's the only time he was at the conference, and then he left. He had his book table there with some helpers who would sell his book. And during that time, my wife and I were setting up the exhibit for Castle Rock Women's Health, so I never got the chance to see George Barna. Heidi St. John was another notable speaker there. She is a prolific author of quite a few books, devotional books, self-help books about homeschooling and motherhood, so busy mothers. And she also has a podcast called the Heidi St. John Podcast. And you might have heard of Heidi St. John. She's pretty well known. And my wife Chelsea and I did get to meet her a little bit, but as I'd find out about just how systematic she is with things, like I found out that I couldn't just snag a quick interview with her. Like if you want something like that with Heidi St. John, you got to kind of talk to one of her persons there, one of her helpers, and then you have to get it screened and booked. And so, yeah, that wasn't going to work either. So unfortunately, I don't have an interview with George Barna for you, and I don't have an interview with Heidi St. John either. There were some other people there that are usually there that I was hoping to get interviews with and could never get the chance, but there's always next year. Truthspresso is like caffeine for the mind each week to take on the world's craziness. So why not do that with some actual caffeine, like in an actual cup? That's why Truthspresso is partnering with 7 Weeks Coffee, Unlike all the big woke coffee companies, 7 Weeks Coffee doesn't use their profits to fund abortions or clown world woke causes. 7 Weeks Coffee is a Christian-owned company that has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to pro-life organizations. In fact, the name 7 Weeks Coffee comes from the fact that a 7-week-old baby in the womb is about the size of a coffee bean. 10% of every sale and upwards of 50% of their profits go towards saving babies. 7 Weeks Coffee has donated to over 850 pro-life organizations. But what about their coffee? Is it good? 7 Weeks Coffee is mold and toxin-free, ultra-low acid, and direct trade sourced from farmers they personally know. Get it ground or whole bean. Try their Hope Blend Medium Roast or their Faith Blend Dark Roast. Sip in serenity and drink with dignity, knowing that you're helping save lives with every purchase. So why not wake up with a podcast and a coffee company that share your values? Check out 7 Weeks Coffee for both delicious and virtuous coffee. If you follow my link at truthhub.org/coffee, for every succulent blend you purchase, a portion of the proceeds will go to Castle Rock Women's Health, a life-affirming clinic that offers comprehensive women's health care and saves babies. Check out 7 Weeks Coffee today and save lives by going to truthhub.org/coffee. That's truthhub.org/coffee. So, the interviews that I got that I didn't play last episode, that I'm playing this episode, are focused more on apologetics topics. And so the first one was for Genesis Apologetics. So I went to the Genesis Apologetics exhibit there, and there was a young lady there who did a very quick pitch to me about what they're all about and what they teach there and stuff. So then I asked, like, well, could I do a quick interview to kind of pitch Genesis Apologetics on my podcast? And she agreed to that. And so here is that interview for the Genesis Apologetics exhibit. This is Daniel Minnick at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference, and I am at Genesis Apologetics with Emmeline. And so, Emmeline, thank you for talking with me this morning.
Absolutely.
So can you tell me a little bit about Genesis Apologetics? I'm sure you talk about the book of Genesis, but what exactly do you cover, and what is Genesis Apologetics about?
Sure. So Genesis Apologetics is a ministry based out of Folsom, California, and our goal is to encourage the believer and challenge the skeptic that the truth begins with the very first verse of Genesis. And this is super important because with all the world telling us that we evolved from monkeys and truth is relative, it's really important to stand on firm of what God said, starting from the very first verse, or you actually undermine the rest of Scripture.
Yes, definitely. So if you don't have "in the beginning God created," you don't have "for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Yeah, so are you young earth or old earth creation?
Yeah, so we are 100% young earth, and that's actually a really important issue because, some people do say, oh, well, God could have used evolution, but the problem with that is if God used evolution, that means millions of years of sin, death, disease, and suffering before the first human ever came into existence. But Romans 5:12 says, through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men. So death came from sin, from Adam sinning, and then death spread to the whole world, to the whole mankind from Adam. So if you put death before sin, what is the punishment for sin? There is no punishment for sin if death was before sin. And so it's important to stand firm that the world was created as God said. It was very good. And that would not have included things like death, cancer, all these other things that we see in the fossil record. It makes much more sense that these fossils, came from Noah's flood, which was a global flood, exactly as described in the Bible. And there's a whole lot of evidence for that.
So you think lots of things buried in rock layers all over the earth is from a global flood and not a 1,000 local floods, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we see sedimentary rock layers that are stretched across entire continents. How do you get a rock layer, one single rock layer, stretched across an entire continent if it's not a global flood? You have to have the water covering the entire continent in order to do that.
Yes, and so I see that you have a display with a laptop there showing, like, it looks like a movie trailer. So what is this movie? Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Absolutely. So the movie is The Ark in the Darkness, and it came out in theaters nationwide in March, and it shows the biblical and scientific evidence for Noah's flood. We partnered with Sevenfold Films, Rolf Streen, who is the artist for the film, and we interviewed 11 PhD scientists from Answers in Genesis, Liberty University, and a couple other places, and it just shares these biblical and scientific evidence for Noah's flood. We also touch on other things like dinosaur soft tissue. Did you know that there are red blood cells, collagen, muscle fiber tissue, and over 16 different types of bioorganic material that we find in dinosaur bones? That can't last millions of years.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Like, so what you're saying is you don't think that could survive for millions of years intact, huh?
Yes, that's a question that is actually the evolutionists are trying to figure out, because collagen, for example, even the largest estimates are 100,000 years tops, and that's secular estimates. We would say that it's probably much, much less, but they'll say, at maximum 100,000 years. Well, that's only a tiny sliver. That's about 1,000th of their timeline of how long dinosaurs lived.
The movie was The Ark in the Darkness?
Yes, The Ark in the Darkness, and it is now available on DVD, streaming, and Blu-ray as well. So you can go to noahsflood.com.
noahsflood.com and check out Genesis Apologetics. And where would someone find Genesis Apologetics?
Well, genesisapologetics.com.
Oh, yes.
And you can also find information on The Ark in the Darkness on our website as well.
Yes, and I will provide links to both of those in the show notes for this episode. So thank you, Emmeline, for talking about Genesis Apologetics and the Ark in the Darkness movie, and I'd recommend our listeners to check those out. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure chatting with you.
So I invite you to check out Genesis Apologetics and to check out the Ark in the Darkness movie and Genesis Apologetics website. And as I said in the interview that I recorded, I will put links to those in the show notes for this episode. So now, the next interview that I did with one of the exhibits at the conference was with Colorado Right to Life. Now, I did an interview with Susan from Colorado Right to Life last year, and Susan was there at the time, and I asked, would you want to do this again? Or there was another guy named Dimitri there at the time, and so she directed me to Dimitri and said, hey, maybe he could do it this time. And so I interviewed Dimitri and asked him some similar questions about what is Colorado Right to Life doing this year. So enjoy. Here's my interview with Dimitri from Colorado Right to Life. This is Daniel Minnick for the Truthspresso podcast at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference, and I am here at the Colorado Right to Life booth here, and I am talking with Dimitri from CRTL, Colorado Right to Life. So, Dimitri, thank you for being with me today.
It's a pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
And so, Dimitri, what is Colorado Right to Life about? I mean, I know you're against abortion and for the life of human beings, but can you elaborate more? What does Colorado Right to Life stand for? What's the mission?
Sure. So Colorado Right to Life is a bit different than a lot of pro-life organizations in the sense that we believe that all human life is equal. Now, I'm going to qualify that statement by saying something a little bold here. I don't believe all pro-life organizations are pro-life, because when they have exceptions or clauses, like they will cite God's commandment, thou shalt not murder, but then they will put an asterisk there. The Bible didn't put an asterisk there. but a lot of pro-life organizations do, where they say in the case of incest or the case of rape, it's okay then to abort, and we're completely against any form of abortion, ultimately any form of murder.
Yes. So, and heartbeat bills, stuff like that. It's like, okay, like if life begins at conception, then there should not be an exception, right?
No, exactly. Because, we've explained it to people over and over again. A heartbeat bill is not a victory because we still have babies dying under that bill. You still have babies being put to death. And all these good-intentioned bills are being paid for by the blood of these innocent children. You look at a 14-week ban, you look at the heartbeat bill bans, as great as those are, or seemingly, they don't follow God's standard of show no partiality.
Yes.
No partiality would be ban abortion from the point of conception, no murder ever.
So just like the laws about thou shalt not murder, even with people who are born, we don't distinguish between them and say, well, if you're a certain age or certain skin color, certain rules apply, certain economic status. Yeah.
No, totally. And that's a good one you brought up, economic status, because a lot of pro-aborts and even Christians, again, well-meaning, will say, well, they're not in a situation to have a child, but it's like no human being's value is dependent on their circumstances. So if somebody's born in poverty, like I was born in poverty, my dad was poor.
So was I, basically.
Yeah, it's a story we all know. Neither you or I was any less valuable in the eyes of God than if we were born into a rich family. So again, completely on board with the idea of no partiality. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are, you're still a human being from conception because you are made in the image of God, you are protected under his law, or should be, ideally.
So, Dimitri, what are the particular battles or issues that Colorado Right to Life is involved in for this year?
So, for this year, there's a proposal that actually made it onto the ballot by pro-aborts. Proposal 80-something. Forgive me, the number escaped my head, but
there's so many of them.
Oh, I know. Might be 89, but we are trying to get people to vote no on that because, again, it's basically RIA 2.0. RIA, it's the law that has it where you can have a child aborted from conception all the way up to 9 months. We're all very familiar with that, being that we're from Colorado, right?
The REA is the Reproductive Health Equity Act passed in 2022.
Yeah, and it's very, very wicked bill. But what this proposal aims to do is enshrine it in Colorado state law.
In the Constitution?
In the Constitution
yes.
of it, yeah. And so the idea is we're trying to get people to vote no, and we're trying to spread awareness of, hey, not only is this wrong, but we should also be combating this. We're trying to wake up churches, we're trying to wake up Christians to say, hey, if it says to stand up for those who cannot speak for themselves, hold back those stumbling towards the slaughter in the Bible, if it really is God's word, which we believe, you should take that seriously.
Yes. So, Dimitri, I know this is an interesting question to think through it, but as they're engaged in the battle with pro-abortionists, what in your mind is the strongest argument that they have offered?
I think the strongest argument they have offered, honestly, is mostly emotional appeal. And by that, they will appeal to mothers who've been in hard situations and say, see how careless the pro-life side is, how callous they are that they don't even consider your situation. I would say that's one of the strongest arguments because, again, where we stand is every child is made in the image of God, and that's what gives them their inherent value. So I think that's partly why pro-aborts appeal to that. Like, you'll talk to a lot of pro-aborts, and they will openly say, hey, we know it's a human being, we know it's a person, but they don't have personhood yet.
Yes. So they
and
basically...
it's like, at what point do they? Like, emotional appeal, I think, is their strongest tool, and they have seriously used it well. Because if you look at Colorado now, it's a very, very blue state.
Yes.
I was a little surprised because at a job I used to work, I was told by one of the ladies there that this used to be a red state, and that kind of doesn't make sense to me. It kind of baffles me because I couldn't even picture that now.
Long time ago.
Yeah, long, long time ago.
So how would someone find out more information about Colorado Right to Life?
So I would go to crtl.org or send an email to office@coloradorightolife.org. And there, our office manager, Scott Shamblin, would be able to send them any information they need, any questions they have, and just in general, what we stand for.
So check out Colorado Right to Life at crtl.org. Am I correct?
That's right.
And I will provide a link to that in the show notes for this episode. So thank you, Dimitri, for talking to me about Colorado Right to Life.
Absolutely. Pleasure talking with you, Daniel.
Thank you. God bless. I hope you enjoyed that interview and the topic of abortion, the right to life, some of the problems in what is often called the pro-life movement when they're too politically entrenched and don't have the real goal of abolishing abortion can be apparent. So we have to realize, what does the Bible say about how God designed life? And that we should be willing to take a stand for the full truth of what that means and not be ready to propose compromises that we think are, palatable to the modern ear.
I think as parents, we assume that kids are going to just know the right way to do things. You have to train them by teaching them to do it over and over again until they actually get it.
This is Yvette Hampton, host of the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. Join us each week for a new episode as we offer encouragement and resources on biblical discipleship from popular speakers and authors, as well as parents just like you and me. Find out more at schoolhouserocked.com or listen anywhere you find your favorite podcast.
And so my third and final interview for this episode was with one of the speakers, one of the workshop speakers, and she was actually a few exhibits down from us in the big tent, and that was Beverly Jacobson. And she has written a few books that are devotional, but kind of coming from experience. And so she had a child with trisomy 18. Now, you might have heard of trisomy 18 and the issue that raised when it came to Texas's abortion restrictions, and a mother that wanted to go out of state. First, she wanted an abortion because she thought that somehow this was a harm to her, that her baby wouldn't be able to live, and that it would also harm her, and so she wanted to get out of state. And of course, that became a talking point about how, this is what happens when you try to outlaw abortion. You cannot possibly do that without risking the health of a mother. And the risk and the possible, loss of life that she could have had just having to deal with going out of state because abortion was not legal in Texas for this. Oh, that shows that you can't outlaw abortion. And so Beverly Jacobson had a baby with trisomy 18, who she says in the interview is 7 years old. And so we do talk a little bit about that as I interviewed Beverly Jacobson. And so, enjoy. Hello, this is Daniel Minnick for the Truthspresso podcast. I'm here at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference. We're in the pavilion and a lot going on, a lot of hustle and bustle, but I am here with Beverly Jacobson, who is an author and speaker at the conference for Verity's Village. So, Beverly, thank you for being with me today.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So what is Verity's Village?
So Verity's Village is our nonprofit ministry that we launched 3 years ago after our journey with our little girl, Verity. I was 18 weeks pregnant with her when we got a diagnosis of trisomy 18, or Edwards syndrome. And many in the medical community consider this diagnosis to be incompatible with life. So we were devastated. We didn't think we would meet her alive. Well, spoiler alert, she is now 7 years old. So wow. She didn't get that memo that she's not compatible with life. But
yes, a 7-year-old is very much compatible with life. Yes.
Absolutely. But we know how hard it is to get that diagnosis, and most doctors just immediately assume that the woman is going to abort that baby because there's something genetically wrong. And we know how hard it is to go through the uncertainty, not knowing whether the child will be born alive or if we will be bereaved. And then we know how hard it is to bring a child home with significant needs as well. And so the Lord opened the door for us 3 years ago to launch this ministry specific to this community, so moms who receive a diagnosis can get practical support and encouragement. We can give them education and help them make connections as needed. We serve all over the country. We've even served moms in other countries, but there's a lot that we can do to help in this vulnerable situation.
Yeah, that's cool, because I know that there is a big kind of case out of Texas for some mom who had a child with was it trisomy 18?
It was the same diagnosis as our daughter.
And of course all the pro-abortionists were trying to say that Texas's pro-life laws there were really going to make her suffer along with her child. Your child can't live. That's a death sentence for the mom too. So this isn't life, but yeah.
Yes, it was a very sad situation. I'm very sad that she made the choice that she did. I wish we could have talked and we could have shared our story, that there's beauty and there's hope. We've worked with a lot of moms who sadly they do end up bereaved, but they choose life and they come back to us over and over and say, I would do it all over again just for those 54 minutes or those 3 hours or whatever amount of time they had with their child. They are at peace knowing they did what they could. They had the opportunity to take photos and make memories, and that is something that will never be taken away from them. And I just wish moms could hear that side of the story, that if they choose to terminate the pregnancy, there's no opportunity for joy or blessing or maybe a surprise ending like we had with our Verity.
Definitely. And so if someone wants more information about Verity's Village, especially, if you're a mom or even a dad in that situation, how would they find more information about Verity's Village?
Yes, thank you. Our website is veritysvillage.com, VERITYS village.com. We have a private support group on Facebook, From Diagnosis to Delivery, but anyone who reaches out through that contact form online, we're going to get in touch with you and have our parent care coordinator coordinate with you, but we would love to walk alongside you on this journey. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Beverly. That is www.veritysvillage.com, and I will provide a link to that in the show notes for this episode. And so thank you, Beverly, for talking to me today.
Thanks again for the opportunity to share.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Beverly Jacobson. And of course, I will provide links to her website in the show notes for this episode. And so these were my interviews that I did. I spent most of the time at the conference by my wife's side, Chelsea, at our exhibit for Castle Rock Women's Health, talking to people, especially when Chelsea was talking with someone, and then other people would come up, and then I would talk to them and pitch her services to them. As I said, I spent most of the time there, but then you'd find sometimes, certain times between when we knew keynote speeches were either happening or over or whatever. So according to schedules, I'd look up what's going on and try to figure out brief times, or I would take my podcasting gear, my portable podcasting gear, and wander around and look for victims. Look for people to interview who would be willing to pitch their products or services, or any speakers who would do workshop sessions who are willing to have a brief interview with me. And so I believe that this year's conference turned out pretty well. A little disappointed that I didn't get some of the interviews I'd hoped for, but all in all, it turned out pretty well, and I got some very nice interviews. And I'm excited to find out what next year has in store for us, God willing. And I hope that you enjoyed this special 300th episode of Truthspresso and the interviews that I did at the Rocky Mountain Homeschool Conference hosted by Czech. And so stay tuned for the next episode of Truthspresso, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truthspresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.